Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad you're here. I am Masha Goodkin, and I work with the Russian-speaking Jewish community at Jewish Family and Children's Services. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you. We're so glad you're joining us for tonight's conversation with Masha Rumer. We are very grateful for the support of our event sponsors, our community partners, and for your support. Thank you. The Center of Children and Youth, which is hosting this event, is a division of Jewish Family and Children's Services. Jewish Family and Children's Services has been caring for individuals, children, families, and the elderly in the Bay Area since 1850, and has been there for the Bay Area community through many difficult times and crises. The current pandemic has had a great impact on us all with continued and serious challenges, especially around mental health. These issues are a priority we are addressing on all levels, from clinical treatment, parent and community education, to our partnership work in schools and advocacy. At the Center for Children and Youth, our team cares for the whole individual and family, providing expert services to children and teens and their families. One-on-one parenting support is an especially important family resource and is one of the highlights of the support model we have developed over the past 25 years. Throughout its 170 plus years, JFCS has carried out its mission to make sure no one is alone and has grown into one of the largest and most effective family service institutions in the nation. JFCS was founded by immigrants and was the primary organization resettling Jewish refugees from the Soviet Union starting in the 1970s. JFCS has also resettled refugees from Iran, Ethiopia, Bosnia, and continues to provide legal immigration services today. In fact, Masha Rumer, with whom we're speaking this evening about her book, Parenting with an Accent, is a volunteer with JFCS, helping people prepare for their naturalization interviews to become US citizens. Masha is an immigrant from the former Soviet Union, a resident of the South Bay, a mom of two, and a writer. Masha got her start in writing as a journalist and college instructor of composition, journalism, and English as a second language. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Moscow Times, and others, winning awards from the New York Press Association. She holds graduate degrees in comparative literature from City University of New York Graduate Center and in communications from Georgetown University. Parenting with an Accent is her first book. Joining Masha in conversation is my colleague, Elina Koretsky. Elina is an immigrant from the former Soviet Union and is married to an immigrant from Turkey. She's a mom to 3 teenagers in a blended family. Elina has led outreach efforts for our programs and services to children and parents in our peninsula communities for almost a decade now. Please welcome Elina Koretsky and Masha Rumer.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to be here with Masha Rumer to talk about her new book, Parenting with an Accent. Masha, this book was so warm and well-researched. Your stories really resonated with me and my experience as a parent and a first-generation immigrant. There are so many parenting books available, but yours is unique. It delves into parenting from the immigrant's perspective. What I appreciated most was it's really a conversation. I wish I had this book when I first had my son, Eli. It would have made me feel so much better about my parenting and helped me ask the important questions that I didn't even know needed to be asked. Can you tell us a little bit about how you wrote this book and what your goals were for yourself and your readers?
Yes, Alina and Masha, first of all, thank you so much for having me here tonight. And of course, thanks to the JFCS. As you mentioned, first of all, I just wanted to give a shout out to the organization because it's helped me and my family so much back when we immigrated to the Bay Area in 1992 as refugees from the, recently Soviet Union, but Russia at the time. And we had, classes, English classes, we had support from the Jewish community, donated furniture, English classes, like I mentioned. We even had a wonderful tutor who'd come to our home and help us orient ourselves and practice English. Her name was Judy. So, and of course, now I'm delighted to be able to volunteer as well and help the former immigrants or current immigrants practice for their citizenship exam. But yes, so to the book, this is the book that just came out about a month ago, a little bit over a month ago. The reason the reason I wrote this book is it's kind of shiny. The reason I wrote the book is because essentially I needed a book like this on my own. When I first became a parent, I felt a lot of, I felt a sense of confusion about my identity. It was almost like an identity crisis all over again, even though I've been in the United States for most of my life at that point. There was isolation, which traditions do I follow? Which ones do I keep? Why does it seem so difficult to pass my language down to my kids? Where do I belong? Where is my tribe? And it's not like there's a one tried and true question answer to all of these questions, but it's something that took me a while to figure out. And I wasn't even expecting that kind of a crisis all over again as an adult. So the reason I wrote the book is just to have a resource for other families, no matter where they're from, to not give advice, because I don't believe there's one way to be an immigrant and certainly not one way to parent, but to have a resource and something that, you can like talk to a friend in the kitchen and commiserate about things that you're feeling that you might not even realize you're feeling them. And of course, there are also a few tips that the book shares, such as, bilingualism strategies and different ways of looking at acculturation. But these are not coming from me. These are coming from different experts and also parents who were in a similar boat and found things that work for them. So it's basically a resource to tell people that they're not alone.
It resonated with me more than you know. While you were doing all this research and talking to expert and really families all over the country, what surprised you most or made the biggest impression with you over the course of this journey?
Oh my goodness, there were so many things. First, right away, I'll mention the personal. I really did not expect to learn so much and to, I guess, kind of like relive through some old traumas of immigration, of being this weird teen, in a new country, barely speaking English. And I've become a lot more compassionate with myself back then, with myself now in the way I parent, and the guilt that I feel about always doing the right thing as a parent in both cultures. And I feel like I've become way more immigrant, if such a thing even exists. Now, I go outside and I hear a foreign accent or speech. I really just celebrate it. It's just such an affirming thing for me, because I realized how many immigrant experiences, are similar now to what they were, for example, 100 years ago and even before. But that's on the personal side. But three big conclusions, I'll just mention them very briefly, are we're all very different in how we got here and where we come from, when we came. Maybe some of us came as, adults, others came when they were like 5 months old. But in one way or another, I think just about every immigrant that I spoke to wants to hold on to some part of their heritage. So that's like across the board. Another thing that I've kind of observed in writing this and talking to over 60 people is that a lot of us as immigrants have very deeply ingrained and often incorrect assumptions about how we ourselves should be adapting and feeling about our identities and about our home and what our children must be like, right? So like shoulda, coulda, woulda, and like all these musts. But a lot of these notions and traumas kind of go unexamined. In fact, when I spoke to a lot of people, some of them have been here for like most of their lives, a lot of people could not answer some questions that I asked because they were either too traumatic or they simply did not know what to say. Whether it's, being discriminated against or leaving their homeland, or like the socializing patterns or the feeling of isolation. And one last thing is there's just no one way of raising a bilingual child.
I hear you there. So like personally, like I think becoming a parent puts your childhood and your childhood memories and experience like at the forefront of your consciousness. And I think this is especially true when you're trying to make constant decisions about how to raise your children, whether it be a little bit more from like the old country where you or your family came from, or your experiences here. And I wonder if that makes child rearing decisions for immigrants even more challenging than native born Americans.
Absolutely. I've spoken to a number of sociologists and read, texts about this. And obviously, we are different from our parents. That's just like the nature of humankind, right? But I feel like it's a fact that immigrants have kind kind of a more complex relationship with their identity and with their multiple cultures, whether it's two or even more than two, or if they're like a third culture kid. So that definitely adds a level of complexity. I can even give an example if you like from my research. Yeah, so a lot of that basically leads to kind of picking and choosing. People pick what they want to keep and then what they want to leave behind. But it's rarely like, you sit down, while pregnant or your partner is pregnant and have this like table of here are the list of things I want to keep and leave behind. It's really not that easy. It's a lot of our identities and where we feel at home changes throughout our lifetimes, which is something also I didn't realize. And it kind of helped me feel a more compassion, I guess, towards my experiences and those of others. But for example, one woman I spoke to lives outside of Detroit. She came here as a 1-year-old from Iraq. She is Chaldean, which is that type of Christianity. And she was a persecuted minority, so she and her family were refugees. And she really, respects and honors her culture and her ancestors. I mean, the culture goes back to like the Mesopotamia. It's ancient. And she always, when she had kids of her own, she really wanted to raise them bilingual or even trilingual because they speak Arabic and Chaldean. So she's like, I'm a mom, I have 2 daughters. I want to raise them bilingual and trilingual and teach them my language. But actually, no, not but. At that same time, her parents did something that I think a lot of us wish we could have as a resource. They said, fine, we'll watch your kids. We will watch them, like we'll be their daycare, right? So you don't need to pay them. You don't need to, do a background check on the grandparents. And obviously, most importantly, they pass down the heritage and you know that they're safe and secure, being fed all those things that you grew up with. And even though that was a really tempting proposition, this woman said, I actually feel kind of iffy about some of the cultural things that I grew up with. She was not allowed to use makeup or date when she was growing up at all. She did not like the fact that the men partake of meals before the women do in her culture, and a lot of other things that she did not agree with as what she considered as who she considers herself to be, which is a feminist parent. And so she decided, sorry, can't do this. And she sent her kids to an American Montessori preschool. So she kept some traditions, but at the same time, the kids did not grow up with the languages and they do not speak fluently. So that's one example. And I'll quickly mention one more. 2 dads who live outside of the Washington, D.C. or in the Washington, D.C. area. One is Ukrainian and the other dad is from El Salvador. And the Ukrainian dad obviously loves the culture and art of Ukraine and Russia and the former Soviet Union, some things, but he cannot bring himself to read some parts of the books that he grew up with because there's not a lot of tolerance there. There's some racism there, and obviously homophobia, and there are 2 dads, right, in a relationship, in a marriage. And the other partner from El Salvador really looks to his family, he told me, for parenting advice and feeding and nurturing the child. But sometimes he hears things like, if your kid does not listen, you just like smack him and then he will get over it or listen. And he says, sorry, that's just not what I want to keep from my culture. Just a couple of different examples.
Yeah, like I feel so lucky because I've worked for the Center of Children and Youth for close to a decade, and I know about all these resources that we have here that like parents could access, but so many other families don't. And there's all these expectations from all sides, expectations from you and from like your native family. And like this question of like balancing kids with like a heritage, language, and culture versus being American enough, and truly all the guilt that surrounds all of it, and families that feel like they're struggling and they're failing, or it's just such an emotional topic. How do you think that the immigrants, either in the book and your personal experience, like have dealt with that?
Oh, that is a very hard question to answer because there's definitely not one response. It's obviously there's so much guilt. I mean, parents today feel a lot of guilt just because by virtue of being modern parents. Plus, we have COVID and isolation. So hello, but at the same time, when you have multiple heritage traditions to balance, it's like, how do you find the balance? How do you find that that level of like 50-50? I remember when I first started writing the book, I had a a woman from China, a mother of my son's friend, asked, "So great, did you find out how to do it? Can you tell me how to do it?" I'm like, I have no idea how to balance these things, because I mean, you will always have somebody whose child is absolutely fluent in like not two but three languages, and they can recite all these traditional poems, and they're going to like these Indian dances and they're perfect, and or they're going to gymnastics 5 times a week, and then on weekends they go to the like Russian school of math. So like it's almost like damned if you do, damned if you don't. And if you decide to go that route and send them the traditional way, maybe the grandparents will be happy. Maybe you will no longer be compared to your cousins all the time at family dinners. But at the same time, then, you know, the kids might feel a little bit weird compared to their American peers. So I guess to answer your question, it's a very complicated topic, and there's no one way to do it. Everybody just eventually finds their own approach. But what I did find is that I think being gentle with yourself and not looking at each one event or each one concert or each one holiday or dish that you make as like the be all end all, because it's just one of many, and it's not the defining moment. And there's so many other opportunities to explore a heritage and the American home that we live in.
It's like reading your book brought up so many memories for me personally. Like I remember having a newborn, and like in a desperate attempt to teach some Russian to my child, I would like tape the words for refrigerator and chair and couch all over the furniture, because I didn't have the songs and the stories, because I came to the US when I was 3. So I like was trying to like get that language in there. But now like parents have all of these different options, from preschool and older, when children can go to immersion schools or bilingual programs. And it begs the question, like you really looked into, like, how do you successfully raise bilingual children in the US? Like, and are you any closer to that answer ever after writing the book?
I'm so glad that you were trying to do it. And I know it's really hard to pass your language down when you were little, you know, when you came to the United States, like a 3-year-old, or if you are a second generation, right? I mean, I think the one sobering statistic I found is that the native language kind of disappears after the 3rd generation. So we as immigrants tend to be fluent, and our children tend to kind of be bilingual for the most part. And by the 3rd generation, like the grandkids, it's pretty much gone for the most part. Again, it's not the hard and fast rule. There are many communities like the south of like the US border. You got the, you know, the Hasidic, the Jewish population, ultra Orthodox communities where people are certainly holding on to Yiddish. But for the most part, that's a trend. So we're basically fighting against natural forces. And it's not a new thing. It's been like this, like for like, say, since the turn of the 20th century, like in the early 20th century, it was a very similar pattern with the wave of Eastern and Southern European immigration. I think one thing that made me want to write this book is the language bit, because I started looking for resources and I just couldn't find any. What I did find was these listicles. Like, if you want to raise a bilingual child, here are the things that you do. Like, you speak to them all the time, you like give them bribes, or you pretend you don't understand when they're saying something in English. And there were books that were very good and interesting, but again, they were very regimented. But as parents of young kids, we did not always have the opportunity to always remember to switch to the native language, because a lot of time it's a really stressful thing for us too, especially if we worked all day, like in another
especially language. If your partner doesn't speak your native language. A lot of times the default becomes English.
Exactly, because you don't want to exclude them. Or if you go to like a parent group or a mom group, and I've even had a woman from Brazil tell me that she speaks to her daughter in Portuguese, but she's always afraid that if she goes to hang out with her peers, at one point they'll be like, haha, who is that girl that's speaking a weird language? And I've certainly had that happen to me too, like in social circumstances. For practicing a language, but at the same time, it creates this like awkward social dynamic of exclusion, unfortunately. So a lot of these rules, basically, the bottom line is we're not necessarily completely relevant to our everyday lives, like especially if we work and we have commutes. At the time when my daughter was little, I had an office job, which was like 9-10 hour day, and then 2 hours commute on top of that, and sometimes calls in the morning and in the evening with different clients abroad. So, I mean, yes, I would really like to practice language with her, but it was really hard. And what happens is we see that it's not perfect, and a lot of parents just kind of throw in the towel, right? We just say, oh, it's not working for me, I must be doing something wrong. Or the child goes to an American daycare or preschool, and they start wanting to be like everybody else, and they suddenly do not want to speak the language of their ancestors. And you can't force them, because if you do, it's actually like been shown that they're going to become more resistant and maybe even resentful of the language itself. And so it's you can't just force a child to speak the language. Maybe some people do. They're like, I won't speak to you unless you respond to me in, like, I don't know, in Swahili or in Hindi, but it's hard. So there are actually many other ways. And one other thing I should mention is that a very popular approach is one parent, one language, OPOL. So you speak to the child in this language and I'll speak to them in my own, and then everything will work out. And that's true. There's like a 75% chance that the child will grow up bilingual. Studies show. There's a really great study from Belgium. But again, it's very difficult to maintain that balance, one. And two, when the child goes into the world, they'll again say English a lot more. But there are many other approaches I found that really work. One other thing I'll say about that is a lot of parents don't have that luxury. Like if we think back to our own, like if I think back to my parents, and for a lot of us here tonight, I mean, we did not grow up in an environment where the parents would come back home at like 4 or 5 p.m. and start speaking these balanced languages, right? It's like a lot of us work around the clock, trying to survive, having maybe multiple jobs at really odd hours. And a lot of times the immigrant families just mix languages. It's also an option. It doesn't work that well necessarily, or like not as high of a chance of surviving, especially if like the other partner only speaks English. But there's like inside or outside of the home, you have one inside, another one outside, or you can speak like the native language at home exclusively until they grow up a little bit and then get exposed to English. But there's no one way to do it.
There isn't. And it's so, like, personally, because I'm so far away from my native language in terms of when I came here, like I never, when I was growing up, I didn't know if I was a first generation immigrant or a second. Everyone's familiar with the terms first and second generation immigrant. There is a concept that you talk about in your book called Generation 1.5 that I found fascinating. Can you speak to that a little bit?
That's a really great question. I actually also was surprised when I heard Generation 1.5. I mean, even just in our own immigrant experiences, like somebody's an immigrant when they came as an adult for work or for graduate school, or if they came like you when you were 3 years old, and the experiences are vastly different. Even in my case, like I, for example, might have a more challenging time connecting with immigrants who just came a few years ago from, the native country. And I might also necessarily not immediately have as much in common with somebody who's like never traveled and never, or like was like 4th or 5th generation American. I mean, so just this is an example, but Generation 1.5 is a way sociologists are looking at different immigrant experiences, and it's cut off at around 12 years of age. I had an opportunity to visit a scholar who deals with immigrant acculturation and different generations. His name is Philip Kassenitz, and he's a presidential scholar of sociology at City University of New York Graduate Center. And he actually, with his colleagues, wrote a really great book called Inheriting the City, Immigrant Children Come of Age, focused on New Yorkers who were either second generation or they came here 12 and under. And for the most part, they're using it in the same way. So they're looking at the kids of immigrants and kids and children who came here as little children, people who came here as little children under 12 years of age, because the experiences tend to be quite similar, not always, but in a lot of ways. And the way they did this is because they think, your work experience here is going to be as an American, your romantic experiences hopefully will be as an American after 12, and so on. But yeah, the experiences are vastly different based on how old we were.
That's I'm going to deep dive into that book. Let me tell you next after this. It made me, so you wrote this book when your children were quite young, and now you've tried a number of different methods, and now they're a little older. Is there something from your experiences from writing and researching that you would have done differently than you did?
Oh no, everything was perfect. I just did it all the right way. No,
me too.
No, absolutely not. Yes, I would have done a lot more things differently. And I think I would have just started by chilling out, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's hard to do when you're an immigrant, to chill out, especially there's this great column that just came out. I think it's in Catapult. I forgot the exact name of the online journal, but it's by Ruth Madievsky. She's also a Russian Jewish immigrant. And she wrote that the eldest immigrant daughter has very different experiences than maybe the younger siblings.
Really?
It's really interesting. Yeah, it's written in a conversational way. And she just like remembers going to the doctor, you know, and like helping with the documents to older relatives and so on. But yes, I would have just really relaxed and realized that I shouldn't expect myself to, you know, first of all, to become friends with everybody who lives in my zip code and had a baby that same month, just because we're neighbors. It really takes a long time necessarily. Like it might take a long time to find what we call your tribe. It might not happen right away. I would have probably not been so worried about doing all of the cultural things correctly and then feeling guilty for them in a like doubly than somebody else might. And yeah, I think one thing that I did experience is language related. I spoke to both of my kids exclusively in Russian, my native language, when they were born, and then they would go to daycare that was not Russian, and then the language would definitely change. And I've noticed that when my daughter, my oldest child, went to an American daycare, she stopped speaking Russian. Like she did not want to do it. And I really tried bribing her with things like with cartoons and with candy and cookies. And she just didn't want to do it. And a lot of times people take it personally, like I immigrated and then like they're just ungrateful. You know, it's like a common theme in the immigrant experience. It's not how I felt, obviously, but it was really hurtful to me. I felt like my heritage was being rejected. You know, the connection to all of the ancestors and the relatives that stayed behind, and a huge part of my past and my identity. But I just decided to let it go and I didn't want to force her, because at the time I was working so much, and I mentioned that in the book. I was working so much, and just with the commute, I was home, I was home for just a few hours before she would, you know, go to bed after having dinner. And I just did not want to spend those precious minutes like forcing her to speak some language she didn't want to speak, because I felt in my case, it would get in the way of communicating. So I've made a decision to give up. And there was so much shame around this that I didn't even tell people about it. But I remember the point that I was like, I'm just going to stop it. So what happened is there were still Russian books. I kept buying them and ordering them, like the old version of books that I grew up with from like all the way in Russia, used books. There were still movies. We still would go to events that were in Russian, but I would not force her to speak the language. And so it was still kind of in the background. And a few months later, I saw her watching this YouTube video about like a doctor, like a mom and her daughter are watching a video about like a medical office with their animals, and they're speaking in Russian. And suddenly I noticed that my daughter started speaking Russian too and imitating that. So I went to the room, and she has all of her stuffies on the floor, and she's tending to them in Russian and feeding soup to them in Russian, like pretend soup. And I was like, aha, that's my opportunity. So that's when we started learning Russian again. And I taught her to read and speak. I mean, not perfectly, of course, but, the best of my ability. So I just found the right time when I felt that she was more open to it.
And you were patient with yourself. You actually like followed your own instincts. But a little bit of, when you're at that point trying to decide what should I do, it's like a little bit of it is a matter of resources and finding out like what's out there that could be supportive for you in your environment that can help you on that journey. When my son was little and I gave up on Russian, there was no Russian community where I lived. I didn't really have a choice. I couldn't do the nannies, but there wasn't any other real resources that I could like incorporate in my life to be successful. Whether it be parenting resources or language resources or even baby resources, like the Center of Children and Youth, there's a program called Jewish Baby Network that brings in all families together of a similar age. And like that would have been so helpful, like life-changingly helpful for me. I don't know if you found the same thing when you were out there in the world looking.
It was very hard, right? I mean, your experience is so common, right? Like, because to pass down language, it's really hard for you to be the only like bearer of the language, right? Because it's all on your shoulders. But in order for it to really be rooted, it's important to have community support. And like when we hear community support, it's, I don't know, like it sounds weird to me, but what it means essentially is if the child hears it outside of the home and from different people, and they speak to hopefully native speakers who will not switch to English, who will, you know, insist on like, or who will stick to speaking the native language, and having fun activities in that language and actually have the need to use it. That's really what leads to success. But if we're like the only, like say Russian speakers, it's really hard to do. And then the kid knows that we speak English, and then they're like, you know, whatever, I'm like, she gets English, why should I even bother? And it's not because they're like, you know, being ornery, it's just because that's that's a human nature, right? And I had a very similar experience. I was very fortunate to find and to make some wonderful friends that spoke Russian and were from the former Soviet Union in my network when I was writing the book in Alameda in California. But a lot of, in most cases, their spouses were American. And so English was a dominant language. So when the kids would get together for these play dates, English felt more comfortable to them, even though we tried to like have these very specific, you know, sing-alongs and like play dates, educational play dates. They were great and they were really helpful, but it's hard to like keep forcing a child to speak a certain language. Yeah. And one of the first questions that would always happen is, okay, do you have Russian preschools here whenever somebody new comes to town? And the answer is like, no, because of course the daycare and the preschools really help. My daughter went to an American daycare, and then later we pulled her out for unrelated reasons. You speak English, we pull you out. No, it's not because of language. And then we found a really wonderful Chinese daycare, and my son ended up going there too. So, but not, obviously, they didn't speak Russian there.
Well, Masha, thank you so much for sharing your stories and your insight from the book. I know we have quite a few questions coming in from the audience. And for the questions that we may not get to tonight, please visit our website for more resources. So let's see what everyone has to say. Okay. Number one, in your opinion, how much resistance for the second language has to do with the inherent historical American resistance to a second language? In talking to immigrants from other countries living in other countries other than the US, it feels like the resistance is strong in the US in particular.
Absolutely. I mean, there is no like formal official language in the United States, but there may as well be. There's a reason that by the third generation, it's practically gone. And it's historic too, because the same thing would be happening, say, 100 years ago, when like bilingualism was considered to be producing mentally inept children. It was considered to be like a weakness as opposed to a strength, intellectual weakness. And there actually used to be quite a few bilingual schools in many languages, not just, for example, Spanish, because Spanish is the most dominant other language right now, and all kinds of languages, public schools, parochial schools. But that all kind of ended with World War I, when there was a lot of suspicion about, the hyphenated American, so to speak. And we even had something called the Babel Proclamation in 1918, where the governor of Iowa basically forbade all foreign language use. Like, you cannot speak any foreign language at all. English is the only language you're allowed to speak. I mean, that kind of didn't last very long, but that sort of shows you the mentality. And obviously that goes hand in hand with the anti-immigrant sentiment, right? Because you can't separate language from the lived people's experiences. There was so much pushback against immigration, especially when our people started coming in from Eastern Europe, escaping the pogroms, right? We had people from the south of Europe coming, and we were considered to be like racially different, and there was a lot of pushback by the nativists. I mean, obviously there was so much pushback against, I'm not even talking about people from other places like Asia, because in 1882, there was like, you could not have people from China. They were basically prohibited from coming to America at all, and they could no longer be naturalized if they're already here. But there's a long-standing tradition of kind of not being so friendly to languages. But yeah, it definitely affects the way we can teach our children our languages, because the kids are so receptive to how the society feels about their heritage and about the way they speak. So if they might see something on social media or hear something in the news that says, go back where you came from and so on, they'll be like, oh, why should I speak it? Right. So yeah, even though there are so many immigrants, there's like a highest number, not percentage, but number of immigrants right now living in the United States. There's still this mistrust of languages. Or maybe, like, one more thing I'll say, on the one hand, people appreciate languages because it gives us a leg up on the economy, right? It makes us more intelligent, so to speak. You can read, like, I don't know, like Goethe in German, but at the same time, when we're talking about the speakers of that language who are immigrants, then there's this kind of a mistrust that happens, and people kind of look down oftentimes when that language may be spoken in public, even though the language disappears by the third generation. Long answer.
A whole other story.
Yeah, whole other story.
So one of something that's super, super timely right now, have you seen the pandemic effect change immigrants' families and priorities?
I mean, yes. I mean, it's like, I mean, everybody's feeling it, right? We're like on year 3 now. So it's definitely affecting everybody, immigrant or not, parent or not. But it's had, various effects. On the one hand, going back to language use, it really helps people to, like, it helps languages survive, and for people to speak the native language and to teach their kids, if they can travel and spend some time abroad when they're immersed in that environment. Or, of course, alternatively, if like the grandma can come or the sister-in-law can come from the other country and stay with the family, maybe for a few months or when the baby is born and so on. And that definitely helps cement the language knowledge. But of course, with the travel being restricted, it's a lot harder to do it. At the same time, one of the benefits, I mean, it's hard to talk about benefits of a pandemic, but one of the, I guess, silver linings is access to like a myriad of different learning opportunities, like such as Zoom that we were on today. Thank you, Zoom, because we can access these resources and maybe classes and tutors all over the world or all over the country. And that's great. It really can help with the language learning. A lot of immigrants, of course, have been doing this even before the pandemic. Like, I knew people who would take Russian classes with a Russian tutor, like odd hours of the day, or a mom who had a Ukrainian math tutor because she didn't trust the silly American math, she called it.
Ukrainian from the Ukraine, like,
yes,
zoomed in. That's amazing.
In the Ukraine, they would do, I don't think they use Zoom, but they use probably like Skype, I don't know, or FaceTime, I'm not sure. But that, I mean, it definitely brought this whole wealth of ability to learn, not just the language, but like do fun activities in that language. I know it's definitely helped my kids when the pandemic struck and my daughter started taking classes online of Russian, and her language definitely improved. And not only that, but my younger son, who was also resisting Russian at the time, was sitting nearby, like playing his Legos. But every day that when the class happened, he would be there playing Legos and listening. And he heard kids laugh in Russian and like chat in Russian and talk to each other. And he thought, that's kind of, my mom is not the only one who like speaks this way. It must not be so weird. And he became a lot more open and he started speaking a lot better just by being in that environment.
That's so sweet and wonderful for you that you didn't have to like put as much pressure on the little one because they're influenced by the older one that finally got with the
somewhat, like, yeah. I mean little steps, right? But we celebrate like little wins. That's the little wins is what it's about. And definitely that was a little win, but step by step.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see what other questions people have. So here's the next one. How do immigrants or people that work with young children support those intersections with various identities in America, especially through racism, where they may not have experienced these things in their home country? So especially when families feel like they need to encourage their child to assimilate to prevent racism or bias. And like, this is such a big, hard question. Like, this is something that we discussed in parent education classes at CCY to like, how do you support families with these things?
I'm not even sure if I'm the best person to really answer that question. I'm sure there are so many resources out there, very timely resources. But from what I've obviously read about and discussed with other families, it's definitely a huge problem. I mean, obviously, like, how does a child identify, for example, if one parent is white and the other one is not white? It really affects them. One couple I spoke to lived in Utah. They still live in Utah. So the mom is this, white American woman, like light hair, light eyes, and the husband is from Mexico, who works as a nurse, and she works as a bilingual teacher, so she's fluent in Spanish as well. And they try to, they don't speak Spanish all the time. That was another surprise to her. She thought she'd speak Spanish to her daughter, but she's just so tired speaking Spanish during the day to the kids she's teaching. She just cannot force herself to keep doing it all the time. But one thing she did note, and so, so they listen to, like, my papi has a motorcycle. That's a book that they're reading. They listen to the music from Mexico. They had the grandma visit from Mexico City. She has a doll that's, dark skinned that she showed me when we were talking, but the daughter identifies as white. So, and it's also like from what I understand, like a predominantly white neighborhood that they live in. So, I mean, that's just all I can say. And I know that at the end of the interview, when we were talking, like the father didn't speak much. Also, his English is not that good, but he's definitely experienced that at work as well, the racism. People will be like, oh, really? Why are you here with me? Like, aren't you supposed to be in Mexico? What are you doing? Like, they asked him about his papers and stuff. Well, he's taking care of them, right? And he's brushing it off. Like I think a lot of us do. We just want to like keep going and not notice these things as first generation immigrants. So he's like, oh, they're just confused. Oh, it happens to everybody. And if they get really angry, I'll just pretend I don't speak English. So it was really heartbreaking to hear their story. But at the end, he says, I speak Spanish to my daughter. She identifies as white. And I'm really afraid of this day when she's going to be, and she's looking for the right word. And then he turns to his wife and says, like, what's that word in English? And she tells him, and he's like, I'm just going to be afraid that she'll be embarrassed of me. So it's like I, when I had that interview, I just couldn't sleep for a few days afterwards. I mean, these are the realities many people deal with. Or you have a child, for example, that might say look Latino, but he might not speak Spanish fluently. So where does he fit in? And then kids in his school might think he's Latino and they assume that he's Hispanic. And even though he does not necessarily speak Spanish fluently because he was born here. But on the other hand, he is not maybe following the traditions enough of, say, his father's culture or mother's culture. So he finds himself stuck between cultures and she just doesn't know what to do, which certainly has an effect. I spoke to a really wonderful psychologist who practices in Queens, New York, in the Woodside neighborhood, which is a very richly Latinx neighborhood. And he was talking about a lot of these problems that specifically that demographic experiences.
Well, I 100% related to that story because I grew up speaking Russian at home, but then in my outside world, I spoke English everywhere. And I went to college and decided to take a Russian language class, but they couldn't decide which class to put me in. I was verbally fluent as a child, but illiterate. Like I couldn't read or write my own name. So it's like it takes years to like come through this. And I'm someone that I felt like grew up here. I came here when I was 2 years old. So I can't imagine the struggles of other families where they weren't as entrenched in men, like haven't been here their whole life. It's just something that we figure out as we get older. And these issues come up particularly when we have children.
Exactly. Yeah. And by the way, I thought you said 3 years old. You were 2 years old when you came.
2.5, close enough.
2.5. Okay. I kept saying 3, but I was a year off. So sorry about that. Yeah, absolutely. It's it's very much a reality. I mean, it can do with the way we look, the color of our skin, the way we feel language wise. And a lot of times, one thing I'll mention is that there's this really wonderful book. It's actually it's not very scientific at all. So it can be read very, very quickly, very easily by a person who's not even like interested in bilingualism as, as a hobby of theirs. It's by Francois Grosjean called Life in Two Languages. And he basically says that a lot of times there's so much shame with people about their language abilities, like they think they don't speak it well enough, or they have an accent, or they don't know, they can't express themselves perfectly, which doesn't necessarily even exist. Like a perfectly bilingual person is a rarity, right? It's not the norm, but we have these expectations of ourselves. And a lot of times it leads to us being ashamed. And we might not even think we're ashamed, but we might not want to speak it when we visit the homeland. We might not feel confident enough to teach our own children. So it definitely affects how we feel.
Well, this is a perfect segue. So the next question that I have on my list from the audience is, how much of a role does location where the kids being raised play? Were there patterns that emerged with people raising their kids in a community where there were many others that share the same cultural heritage, as opposed to raising kids in a place where there weren't many others from their cultural background?
Definitely. I mean, it's like a fact. I mean, and there's so many wonderful essays and books written about kids trying to hide or quote unquote assimilate, especially if they feel like they are a language or heritage minority. In order for the language to be transmitted to the next generation and supported, and just basically for it not to die, community support is very important. And again, not just at home, but outside of the home. When I was doing my research, I came across this really interesting table that basically said, here are the things that damage the language, and here are the things that help the language. And then the damage, of course, that was like this really like fact that just like blew me away. And that was, if there's a mentality of individualism is really prized highly, as opposed to like a communal outlook on things, that might hurt the language, the immigrant language, from like, when it comes to its survival. If there are jobs in the language, it helps it survive. If there is like cultural and religious, perhaps, programming, it helps it survive. If there are many people living close together, as opposed to being scattered around, that also helps it survive. So yes, but at the same time, I had a chance to interview one of the bilingualism experts who works at Florida Atlantic University, in South Florida, and she works with Spanish populations, and she basically said that even if there's so many Spanish speakers around in that area, as the kids are growing up bilingual, their Spanish eventually recedes and the English becomes stronger, even though there's the Spanish support.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it's super weird, but that's what she noticed. Unless there's like so much effort in preserving it and continuing to
and I'm assuming family support.
Yeah, absolutely. Even, and regardless of like the socioeconomic status, a lot of families she looked at were, fairly educated, also like the range, like well-to-do. And that was a very similar experience across the board.
Yeah. So that brings me to the next question that we have from the audience. How did the people you interview find community?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's such an important question. I think it was just different for everybody. I think sometimes we just try to like find what's available and try to fit in, right? Trial and error, or maybe eventually we do, or maybe we don't. I mean, especially if parents of young kids, there's the talk of like, you might have really close relationships with, say, other mothers who you spend a lot of time with as a parent of a newborn, and then as the kids get older, you just grow apart. I think that's a very common experience no matter where you're from, or especially at least in the United States that I've been reading about it here. I don't know about other countries, but it takes time. One woman I spoke to was from Colombia, and she had a child with an American man. Her husband was native English speaker. He only speaks English, and she speaks Spanish. And they had a baby, and she just joined her parent group from her doula. So they were all native speakers, I think primarily white. And she hung out with them for the most part. But when her daughter went to school, she ended up meeting a lot of Colombian families, or families where there was one partner from there and the other one was American born, not Hispanic or Spanish speaking. And suddenly she felt like this kind of a floodgate opened up for her. She was like, wow, I feel like I can really honor my language. I just feel like I can feel at home. And now they get together for holidays, they eat traditional foods, they honor these like I don't know, like rituals, like there's a Christmas tradition when they light the candles, and like before COVID, and they would get together and the kids would light the candles, and it's really sweet. And it just does take time, but it's not like this for everybody, right? It's, for example, like I mean, it doesn't mean that a person from a certain culture has to just get along with those from that same culture. I think it's very different from everybody. But what I did find from speaking to psychologists and many parents, they often felt more comfortable with those from their own background, but some of them didn't necessarily. It's not like a hard and fast rule. And also, if I may bring up that, like, I wish I knew about the Jewish Baby Network myself. I just didn't know, and other support services, like, for example, the Jewish Family and Children Services offer. That also brings me to, the experience of Jewish refugees from the former Soviet Union, right? Because we were, I mean, aside from just generations of anti-Semitism and not being able to live in Russia proper, and only being beyond the pale, I mean, the Soviet Union was an atheist country, and you were just not allowed to practice any religion at all. I didn't even know that I was Jewish until I was 8 years old. And I found out in my school papers. I stayed behind and I was looking at my file, and I see that it says Jewish. See, like, I'm talking about it now, and I'm like, oh my God, should I not be saying this? And then I'm like, oh, it's a Jewish event, so it must be okay, because that kind of discomfort about discussing it publicly still stayed in some ways with me. And I came home and I said, oh, it must be some kind of a really cool African tribe. I had no idea what that meant. And obviously, I now have a Jewish home. We're raising our children Jewish. We do Shabbat, we do the holidays. But at the same time, for a lot of people from the former Soviet Union, they don't feel comfortable doing that, because there's always like, oh, are you too religious? Are you going to be like, too much of this? There's a lot of concern about how they appear. So that's why even American Jews were typically surprised when we started coming. And you got these Jewish people coming from the former Soviet Union who have the tree, even though they don't call it the Christmas tree. Yep. Right, the yolka, right? It's not about Jesus, but it's still there. We eat pork, and so on. So it's a lot of times, a lot of people are just uncomfortable, even resistant, or feeling unsafe about reaching out to their religion and the practices of their ancestors.
I relate to that on so many levels. Just with like the family history and the background, like it just wasn't like, you're constantly making these decisions whether we should, like, how Jewish to be or how much to follow things. And if we need to like dive deeper. Like I'd never stepped foot in a JCC or a JFCS until I started working in them. And that's just because it wasn't encouraged where I was growing up.
Yeah,
it's like, oh,
yeah.
you're Jewish, but you're just culturally Jewish. You're fine.
Yeah, exactly,
So,
exactly.
and what I didn't realize is now that I live here and I'm part of all these networks and its communities, this is how communities are built, and you get to decide how much you want to be a part of it, but knowing that the resources are there and it's available. Like I would have loved to take parenting classes when I had a newborn before I moved to California. I just didn't know they existed. And now actually through Zoom, it makes it so much easier to get these resources out there and to be able to participate and get help that you need, particularly if you aren't in a place where there's a plethora of them like they are here. So I think we have time for one more question. Did you find that most immigrants partner with or marry other immigrants, even if they're not from the same culture? And is there research to support that? Like, I know I did, but I didn't realize this might be a trend. What did you find out?
So I'm looking for the exact numbers in my notes. So basically, definitely, I mean, up until like the 60s in America, people weren't even supposed to in many states marry somebody of a different race. Like that was like miscegenation, which is terrible. So it's pretty recent. But yes, marriages and partnerships between different immigrants and between immigrants and native-born Americans are on the rise. And for that, I'll look to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and they're predicting it's going to continue being on the rise. For example, now, or at least just a couple years ago, 1 out of 7 marriages, new marriages, was either an interracial or an interethnic one. So, and that's like double the generation ago. So it's definitely on the rise. But again, it brings up, its whole set of, like, you don't marry like a person, you marry a family, you marry a community. And of course, in a lot of cultures, there is this, a lot of people like feel like their child should marry somebody within their own culture or religion, to preserve the heritage, right? Like literally a matter of life and death to some people. But I did find, actually, from that same interview with Professor Philip Kassenetz, they found in their research that the longer the child waits, like not married in the early 20s, not married in the mid 20s, late 20s, by the time they're around 30, the parents kind of tend to ease up a little, and they're like, just get married, have grandkids, we're fine, just as long as we get some grandkids out of this. Not everybody, but a lot. Yeah.
Which is, having known parents everywhere, they're kind of the same.
Probably, yeah. And I mean, it certainly happens with, here too, I'm sure, like Protestant and Catholic marriages, or like different part of the country, certainly. But an added layer of complexity for immigrants.
Well, I have enjoyed this so much. Thank you so much. Thank you for writing this book. I have recommended it to dozens of people that
Thank you so much.
Are in various stages of it, and I'm a huge fan and supporter. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us this evening.
Thank you so much, Alina. Thank you so much, JFCS and Masha Goodkin. And thanks to all of you for coming today. It was really a pleasure to be here and speak to you and hear your questions and experiences.
Okay. Well, so many of us from immigrant backgrounds don't have the extended family around us to help, or the issues that we're facing don't resonate with parents who had different concerns. So the Center for Children and Youth Resources and our community is critical to families. So if you need support, we're here for you. Take a look in the chat and see the links that we have for our comprehensive family services. And thank you all for joining us.